Hello and welcome from Mianjin, which you may know as Brisbane. I acknowledge the Turrbal and Jaggeras people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. Their vast lands extend north and south of the Brisbane River and as far west as the base of the Great Dividing Range. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to all First Nations people right across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. I recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' ongoing connection to land, water, community, and their enduring and alive cultures. I'd also like to offer a warm welcome to our international guests today. We have a large contingent from New Zealand online. We also have participants from the Philippines and Belgium. So warm welcome to everyone. I'm Dr. Lorraine Cherney from the National Regulators Community of Practice at ANZOG. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege today to be joined by the absolute powerhouse that is Professor Martin Lodge from the London School of Economics. So Martin is co-director of the Centre for Analysis of Risk and Regulation and Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. This is a very early start for Martin, and we do hope that he has at least one coffee on board before he kicks off. So before we start the webinar proper, I'd just like to take a few moments to give you a few points about our NRCOP webinar series. So we run these webinars monthly, either fully online or in a hybrid format with an in-person audience from across all the different jurisdictions in Australia. We cover a wide range of topics of interest to regulatory practitioners and academics. All of our webinars are recorded and available on the ANZOG website. In fact, we have around 60 webinar recordings available, along with numerous recordings from the conference that we held last year. So if you don't already have plans for your weekend viewing, you do now. If you're not already signed up to receive our NRCOP comms, can I suggest that you do so, and so that you can keep abreast of all the events that we have coming up. So today we will be using the Zoom Q&A function to submit questions to Martin. You also have the option to upvote questions that you like the look of. We'll be running this session with some participation from the audience. So Martin has a number of questions that he would like to ask of you, and you can use the chat function to provide your responses. So now I have the great pleasure to hand over to Martin for him to give us his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lorraine, for describing me as a powerhouse. This feels, I feel already re-energized just by being described that way. So thank you all very much for sharing your evenings or mornings or lunchtimes or whatever it might be, midnight snacks with me for the next hour or so. As Lorraine said, I'm part of something called the Centre for Analysis of Risk and Regulation, which very much emerged as a sort of the northern twin of all these activities in regulation that occurred in Australia. And it's always been sort of one of my kind of key interests, really, to keep this relationship going and to keep the exchange. So I hope this can be just the first of many of these kind of exchanges and so on. But so today on the sort of to the business, so to speak, sort of my talk is about regulators and risk appetite, and subtitle risk-based regulation. So what this means really is it comes in two parts, and as Lorraine says, there will be a few moments where you can express yourselves on keyboards, and hopefully you do so, because I'm more intrigued to learn about you than to listen to me in that sense. So, but there's sort of two key themes here. So the first, and possibly I guess the most well established, is that all regulators, whether they're inspectors or regulators that have detection, standard setting, as well as information gathering, sort of behavior modification authority, are supposed to be risk-based in their activities, and that means ultimately that it allocates their resources and attention according to some degree of calculus of probability and impact, which of course means you need to have some kind of information about likely probabilities and likely impacts in that sense, which is sort of a big difference to, you might say, calling a world of uncertainty where you wouldn't even be aware what kind of impact you have, or what an impact a risk might have, or what potential probabilities might exist. So really sort of the key question here is risk, sort of narrowly defined for risk-based regulation, is about the impact or severity. And here in particular, the importance is not any old, you might say, harm or potential harm. It's about very often the irreversibility of harm, which is sort of central, and the question of likelihood. But of course, when we think about risk-based regulation, and many of the forthcoming slides in sort of part one will be about potential issues, which is sort of the risk-based regulation part, is one of the key questions already is to whom are we sort of trying to be risk-based to? Are we thinking about the risks to the regulatory or regulatory entity, including inspectorates, survival, make sure our chief executive doesn't end up on the media headlines, or worse, goes overboard, so to speak? In the UK, might end up with a knighthood for their greatness, or is it the risks to particular target populations, very often vulnerable people, some of those who might also be not known to us, in the sense of there might be populations that we are trying to support which would like to avoid contact with state authorities rather than people such as children or elderlies and so on only. And then there might also be the question, is it risks to statutory objectives, which is very often the argument when it comes to financial regulation. So statutory objective is stability of financial markets, or in energy regulation it would be security of supply and all that sort of thing. So here's already one kind of key question when we think about risk-based regulation, is to whom. So these are that would be sort of part one of the package. Part two, possibly somewhat shorter, but is also about the kind of key question about risk appetite. And here, sort of again, as many things when we talk about regulation and public management, ideas brought forward in sort of the corporate governance world move into the world of the public sector 5 years after they were sort of invented in the private sector. In this case, though, I would say it's moved across, not at the time when it became unfashionable to talk about risk appetite. So here, the key critical issue is that if you want to run a risk-based system, you need to have some idea about what risks you would like to tolerate and which risk you don't, and that raises what people nowadays call the risk appetite. Other words are around, and when one talks about risk appetite, it's not so much about how thirsty am I for a cup of coffee early in the morning, or not so that early in the morning, but it's more about what sort of people refer to as, am I willing to fight this, or am I rather running away? In that sense, that's a fight or flight. So if I don't like the, do I run away from this risk because it's intolerable, or do I want to fight the, dinosaur looking across my cage? In that sense, and, give it a go, because I think this is part and parcel of what the things I want to do. In order to be successful in the job, I need to basically accept that certain things, I have to encounter certain things, such as fighting a dinosaur in my cage, in that sense, rather than just run away from this. So this is sort of the two parts. So let's get first into sort of part one of the kind of over to you kind of moment. So I would like to ask sort of two questions to you. I mean, one is basically an agree disagree kind of question. It's impossible to implement it. And the second one is, where you can sort of write it in. Lorraine will describe it to you. What you would say is the top 3 risks that you are facing. But let's go first to the first one. Over to you, Lorraine, as poll master.
Great. So I don't actually think I need to introduce this, because the polls are going off by the looks of it. So there is lots of talk of risk-based regulation, but it is impossible to implement in practice. So we're asking you, do you agree or do you disagree? It's looking that disagree is the firm winner here. We'll give it just a little bit longer because people are still voting. I think we're getting, I can't imagine the remainder of the participants are going to change my mind here on what is in front of me, which is a very strong disagree. So that's 80% disagreeing with that and 20% agreeing.
Okay. Okay, so and then sort of if we have these kind of, I mean, shall we do the top three risks, Lorraine, or is that
Yeah.
from? Yeah, so then basically sort of the next poll, just kind of we might not be able to count 270 top risks, top three risks, but if you could just give us a view about when you think about your organization, may it be a regulatory inspectorate type of activity, what kind of key risks, top risks would you, kind of put in your risk register in that sense? So what are the top three? So over to you again.
Aha. So we have reputational, community and safety, contraventions of legislation by regulated entities, loss of trust, reputation, statutory, workforce planning, reputational risk, insufficient privacy or technology architecture, child safety, reputation, financial work. We're definitely getting a strong reading here for reputation. And I think so that was loss of trust again. I think we might call it there, and we can provide those responses to you, Martin.
Okay. And so, yeah, so I think sort of there, I think sort of the emphasis we heard about reputational will be a theme which will come out. And I think also the issues like financial and workforce planning and so on, I think raises sort of some of the issues, and maybe the 80-20, which is a lovely, just might point to the possibly too strong word impossible in this question, which might be it might have been too much of an undergraduate essay question. So to what extent do you disagree here? So so in that sense, so thank you very much. And so let's see whether I can you change your mind or not in that sense. So when you were talking, and I think that is I think a lot of the, you might say, reputational part of your points. I guess one could sort of think about sort of a number of ways we could sort of think about risks of risk-based regulation. I mean, one, and I've given them here sort of four headings, not all of them arguably on one single dimension. I suspect if one asked ChatGPT or something about sort of the risks of risk-based regulation, it would sort of emphasize the technical, although I haven't tried, so I've disabled that function in my life. So I think one can sort of talk about here in sort of the risk-based regulation, what I would call technical, or what other people might call operational in that sense, is to say, well, what are sort of the key issues or the key ingredients for a machine, kind of holding everything else constant, you might sort of say, or stable or friendly, and so on. So one is clearly to run a risk-based regime of whatever kind, one needs to have key risk indicators or KRIs. So one needs to have some formalized idea about what are sort of the key things that exist, and that's sort of one of the key emphases of risk-based regulation, is this idea about having a formalized way of selecting targets, you may say. And for critical KRIs, the key issue is they need to be predictors of unfavorable events. So in my sort of beautiful life at university, an unfavorable event would be that plenty of students fail. And you might argue what would be a good predictor for, that kind of unfavorable events that I would like to predict, and also my employer would like to kind of avoid. What would be a good indicator? Would it be kind of their earlier essay submissions, or you might argue it is attendance? That'd be the fourth most important part. So a critical predictor might be, well, one would hope so, attendance in my classes or seminars is a good reliable source of making it to the exam. Not that I provide the exam answers, but they get stimulated enough and read it. That would be the benevolent interpretation. So therefore we would like a KRI on attendance, you might say, and then we could sort of deal with strategies to deal with attendance. But of course, for one, basically to be able to sort of raise these kind of chains between, what is a good predictor of an unfavorable event happening might not always be as straightforward as just saying, how many people get out of bed in the morning to turn up to Lodge's 9 o'clock seminars on, the future of risk-based regulation. But there are also some other elements here which often drive arguably more the selection of KRIs than sort of a thinking about, you might say, a line, a good predictor. One is the basic point about data availability, which might be either the ability to measure in the first place as a problem that, once we start measuring something, everyone starts gaming, so one doesn't even know what one is looking at. So how reactive, you might say, is the data once one starts taking it seriously. Otherwise known as Goodhart's law in money supply measurement. There might be issues about, kind of that some organizations have the data but don't want to share it. And then, of course, there's this, more normal argument, I guess, in the literature between leading and lagging indicators. So if we took financial information as an indicator, that is usually seen as a lagging indicator because financial returns are from the past in that sense, right? And one might argue possibly maybe changing leadership in strange ways is a good predictor of later financial management issues that subsequently then might sort of end up in a sort of a failing institution and so on. So there are sort of some critical issues here. Of course, there are some questions here about what does one do, basically, about sort of, you might say, sort of the boundary line of KRIs. So basically, first we would expect some variance, but how do we think, for example, about near misses? And that goes centrally to part 2 of the theme today. It's about the risk appetite. So do we basically say, well, we don't want to touch things that look pretty close to looking not right, or basically do we say these are fine? And I think there's sort of a key question here for the risk appetite of an organization. To what extent are we interested in those close to the border, or are we basically only looking at those that have moved across a certain threshold? Because you might argue if one of the fundamental problems in our regulatory system is what people nowadays like to call coasting, we might be interested in the near misses, you might say, of certain kind of trigger points rather than having the trigger point itself. So these are, you might say, sort of the questions, even if we just sort of think about KRIs and the limits of those and how we handle them in that sense. Now, the second part is what you might want to call in the sort of operational organizational part, is that every organization has its own kind of biases. We might have certain disciplinary kind of professional kind of views about looking at data, which other disciplines might disagree with, but because they're not present in our organization, we just don't know about it. There might be questions about taboo issues, which sounds possibly more intriguing than it actually is, but that a taboo issue is ultimately an issue that we're not allowed to talk about because it might be embarrassing to our leadership, for example. They might have said we are a regulator doing these kind of things, and then counter information comes in, or it might be issues about geopolitics that one can't talk about because that might be a strategic market for this particular kind of institution. These are sort of taboo issues here. And then there are some kind of other kind of issues about risk-based regulation, which basically is sort of the idea about sort of how do we think about basically emerging risks in particular. And there are sort of counter views. So if we are risk-based, you might say we will only look at those things, as said on the first slide, where the probability and impact, it signals these are the things worth looking at. But how do we handle, or how do we dedicate resources to organizations that as a result would never be inspected, to put it lightly? Which in the British or English university system, you might say, if one was risk-based, certain institutions would rarely be inspected, and others, there would be plenty of attention in that sense. But we need to, partly for legitimacy, partly because there might be something seriously going wrong, need to dedicate certain resources to those institutions that we think are well functioning. And taking, especially from the enforcement literature, if we want as regulator inspectors to understand what might be going on in terms of technical or organizational change, we need to dedicate resources to emerging risks, and therefore inspection might be more of a learning activity rather than a risk-based activity. And I think sort of every inspectorate regulator needs to sort of think about how do we dedicate resources that a risk-based approach would tell us not to do, in order to basically find out about emerging risks or low risk or whatever you want to sort of call them. And then sort of there are sort of other kind of risks here, which to some extent you mentioned by reputation. This is risk-based regulation really the risks of the media headlines rather than the risks to the target populations and such like. There are risks about sort of the fossilization of such frameworks. So we've done it once, please don't do it ever again, and therefore we just leave it forever after on our desk. Ossification, I suppose, is a more formal regulatory word, but I like fossils more. And then sort of there's also these organizational biases that basically, when one looks at the research on risk-based regulation, that's often the risks that are being identified are those to one's own entity, rather than looking at risks that might cut across different organizations. So, risks which might be shared between an economic regulator and a competition authority, for example, would be sort of one of those issues where one would predict, at least from the comfort of an academic armchair, that these would fall possibly between the cracks between the kind of the two kind of organizations. And there's also, which was one of the critical issues about the financial crisis, there's this argument that risk-based regulation often focuses, partly for convenience and on the regulated entity itself, rather than thinking about the risks to the whole system in that sense. So how does one sort of balance between entity and system in one's kind of system? So these are, you might say, that would be sort of the standard technical operational kind of concerns. And then sort of there are three other type of risks I just briefly want to highlight. Sort of one is what it might call here multi-organizational. And this is that kind of looking at regulatory regimes more generally. Most regulatory regimes rely on shared authority or dispersed authority between different inspectorates and regulators and so on. So despite what the literature seems to assume, a single regulator looks after, a certain set of regulated entities, reality is often a bit more messy, namely that, kind of one inspector regulator sort of has to work, doesn't necessarily has to work with others, but basically the regulated entity is faced by, multiple, you might say, sort of bodies which have an interest in its behavior, one might say. But for risk-based regulation, indeed, there might also be issues informing the risk appetite. Is what happens if, you might say, the well-intended judgment on an entity's performance ultimately then sends a signal to other parts of this wider regulatory universe that has then consequences, because it means that it is used for an openly partisan political decision and so on, which in itself might then delegitimize your own inspectorate's kind of well-intended, you might say, judgment calls in that sense. So the argument is, for example, if I declare a certain facility as unsafe, this then gets shut down, privatized, or whatever else. My judgment, an unsafe installation, which might be very fair to be a fair case, then becomes part of a wider debate about how the public sector should be organized, privatized, and such like. And that in itself might be seen as a risk to the inspectorate or the regulator. And then sort of the other two, which haven't been discussed so much in the literature, is also to what extent is there a risk of risk-based regulation to lead to what some people like to call a catastrophic kind of risk, namely that the organization of risk-based regulation leads to such kind of system that basically it puts so much strain into the system that in itself the legitimacy of the system is put at risk. And that is sort of, you might say, headlines such as people committing suicides because they can't deal with inspection load and such like, which is different to what you might want to call sort of a systemic risk, which basically the argument is to what extent does risk-based regulation support the survival of the system. And of course, most of you will think, what on earth is he talking about? But, sort of risk-based regulation is supposed to support the systemic survival, you might say, of a system. But to what extent are we, you might say, confident that the things we measure and that we look about are basically not sort of deflecting our attention from other, you might say, more problematic kind of developments and trajectories and so on. And here the sort of the metaphor is not the Titanic, but you might call it the Andrea Doria effect. And, you know, for connoisseurs of shipping disasters on Discovery Channel viewings and so on, the Andrea Doria, the problem was that basically, you know, they had all the settings, but they didn't know that they had a different setting on, basically, where they therefore didn't understand the distances, and therefore they crashed in that sense. So this is basically sort of the kind of concern with these kind of risks. So these are, you may want to call the risks of risk-based regulation, but when we sort of think also, you might say that sort of we can also distinguish to sort of go down one level of the helicopter view from these kind of points between sort of questions also which are raised between sort of, we may want to call the entity selection, the you know, I'm going into an installation and have a look, and you might say the risk of risk-based regulation of while having a look and writing about it. So here, when we sort of talk about entity selection, pre-inspection kind of moment. Here, of course, this raises sort of issues about, you know, what are, again, sort of the KRIs, you might say. So the data availability, do I trust it? What is a portfolio? How do I weigh, you might say, different sources of data? How do I look at sort of different criteria? I mean, there's sort of clearly an issue about those kind of elements. You know, do I emphasize, well, the near miss part, or, you know, does it have to be clearly, you know, hitting the trigger points 3 out of 5 and off we go? That kind of question. There might be issues here about the inspection style or inspection type. So does one rely on, you know, kind of 6 months pre-announced inspection, where then the entity can prepare well and, you know, paint all the walls and treat everyone nicely for a while? Or does one rely on, you might say, unannounced inspection, or very short, you know, short announcements before the inspection happens? So to what extent does one rely on unpredictability or not? There are then sort of questions about, you know, is it possible, if it is possible within the remit of an organization, to choose between what one might call a light touch inspection, which basically goes in, has a brief conversation, you might say, seeks to reassure itself about sort of the running of an organization? Or do we think that proper inspection has to be basically a full scale, you know, kind of inspection of every little part of the organization, right? There might be sort of questions here, if that is available to a particular regulator or inspectorate and so on. And then, of course, there's also a question about frequency, and that raises then issues about resources, which I guess you also raised about in your answers about the 3 risks about finance. So risk-based regulation to some extent was supposed to deal with this puzzle about their limited resources, and therefore how do I allocate my resources to those things that need most attention, you might say. But the problem is, of course, if the resources are so low that I can't even properly do risk-based regulation because there's not enough there, and I still need to sort of keep an eye on everything else, then basically there's a question about how often does one come back, or can come back to different kind of institutions. But there's also the kind of question, which I think where the literature moved on, is basic question about how do we deal with those that have been deemed excellent. So on one hand, you know, a lot of attention, rightly, I think, has been on failing or, you know, needing improvement type of organizations, where basically one has to come back and sort of see whether they're responding in the right way or not, and then one takes a judgment. As a result of which, there was always this view, and I think if we had been here now 15 years ago, we would talk about something like earned recognition in the kind of UK, and I can spell recognition, I apologize for the spelling mistake, earned recognition here, which basically means if you are sort of deemed excellent, then, you know, the regulatory inspection burden will be lower by not being inspected again for, you know, forever or for a long period. But that raises then again a kind of question of risk appetite, is to what extent, you know, is the excellent of today something that is sort of a stable entity which we can predict to exist forever after, or for a certain amount of time? Or are we thinking about a sector where there's a huge amount of churn in staff, where the resources are poor possibly to the sector, where, you know, organizational leadership also is characterized by large degrees of churn? So to what extent, you know, are judgments of excellence, you might say, the, you know, judgment of an organization for a very short time period, or to what extent can we use this as a good predictor for the future? And I think here again, I think there's been a little bit of limited kind of attention on these kind of questions. So these are, you might say, the risk of risk-based regulation, which all feed into the kind of debate on risk appetite. But then sort of, and then we come to the quiz after this slide, and Lorraine, I'll speed up now. So these are more kind of bullet points here. So there's, of course, sort of, once we've decided on which entities we are going for, there's also then sort of the question about the risks of risk-based regulation once we are there, basically on site, so to speak. So here, basically, the kind of key issues are, what are sort of the biases of those people who do the inspection. There's a large literature in socio-legal studies about what are the biases of an inspector who wants to be seen as a good person in that sense, or a credible person. Usually that is seen as a peer pressure, kind of, when I'm a good inspector, I want to be looking good, I want to appear as a good inspector vis-a-vis my other inspectors, not necessarily, towards the community. There are questions about the relational distance, so how close am I professionally to the people I'm inspecting, geographically too, you might say, especially a problem, you may say, for small island and other sort of small entities, when everyone knows geographical context where everyone knows each other. But then, even when we sort of take away those sort of well-established kind of biases, what are, you might say, the biases that sort of might emerge from the kind of information that is given to the people who are supposed to do the inspection. So should they basically go into an organization not knowing anything whatsoever to have an open mind, or should they basically be given the most fine-grained information about the performance, which might already sort of shape their kind of their anticipation about what the kind of grades they're going to sort of give? Are they basically biased to certain areas of the statutory objectives rather than others? Are they basically concerned about basically the implications of their judgment for the entity, and therefore a bit more benevolent or not, or aggressive in that sense? Or do they basically, which again, is widely established, do they want to appear consistent with the previous judgment? All of these kind of issues are sort of quite central and one might say under research, but it raises fundamental questions here about how do we think about the creation and the establishment of what you may want to call inspection teams. Should there be basically responsible for that entity over a lifetime? Are there, or should they basically be picked by as a lottery? All of these kind of questions are sort of central for the operation of this, and thinking then about how do we establish consistency of judgment, whether it is basically about ex post review, by extensive training activities. So to what extent is there, you might say, a professional view about what it is to inspect, and is there a consistency of view in these kind of elements? And then finally, there's also the question about the communication of the results to different, you might say, audiences. So is a communication to other regulators in this field, which might include ministerial departments, the same as it is, you might say, the public facing towards a school, or the entity one is regulating, whether it's a nuclear facility and so on, or or do we communicate also differently to the wider public in that sense, and what language we use and so on. So these are all sort of quite critical kind of questions here, which also relate to risk appetite. So in order to get to risk appetite, so now it's back to a bit of quiz time. So Lorraine, do you want to take over again?
Great, thank you. And just to let the online participants know, we will collect up the responses from all the polls and the questions and provide this along with the resources from this event on the ANZOG website. So looking at the first question, does your organization have a formalized risk appetite or range of appetites? And that's just a simple yes or no. The second question, do you think that a risk appetite is shared across your organization? And the responses there are from strongly agree to strongly disagree. The third question, and is this aligned with its risk-based approach? And then the fourth question, can your organization manage the risks to the level that have been set? So we have lots of people currently voting, and we'll let that go just a little bit longer, Martin, so that we get a good range of responses there. So scrolling through these at the moment, nothing is jumping out at me as being one way or the other. So with the first question, does your organization have a formalized risk appetite? About 67% are saying yes. We're still getting some votes in, but about 67% are saying yes. Do you think that a risk appetite is shared across your organization? Again, we're looking at 40% agreeing and 48% not agreeing. So there's no real strong feeling on this one that I'm picking up. And then for the third question, and is this risk appetite aligned with your organization's risk-based approach? 53% agree, 7% strongly agree. We've got around about 40% not agreeing or strongly disagreeing on that one. And can your organization manage the risks to the level that have been set? And we're looking here at about 55% agreeing or strongly agreeing, and the remainder then not agreeing or strongly disagreeing. So not a great deal of divergence on that one. So as I said, we will collect up these responses and pass them back to you, Martin, and then also to the participants from today as well. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. So lovely split. So maybe we should, put you 260 odd people into a room and fight it out, basically. So, nicer. Well, we could call it polarized in that sense on the media. But so thank you all very much. I think this is sort of, does represent, you might say, not, something that, I would sort of recognize in my other parts of research. But I'm, as you can sort of see from the things I will say now, I think each one of these questions raises sort of some fundamental question about the connection between sort of different elements of, kind of on the one hand, a process that is called risk appetite, sort of diagnosis and setting a document up at the board level that's supposed to be then communicated downwards, you might say, and to what extent is it recognized actually in the day-to-day work of an organization and so on. So so these are sort of the fundamental challenges to some extent. And the last question raises then also issues about the capacity of an organization to basically deal on its sort of explicit commitment, so to speak. So if we sort of think about again the idea here. So the underlying question or the idea is that basically we can only do risk-based regulation if we basically have a clear view, and it is shared between regulatees and regulators about the kind of risks that we would like to engage in and so on. And that is already the first point, I think, is quite an important part here. So I think there needs to be a clear understanding, not necessarily a written down memorandum of understanding between those organizations in the regulatory domain about, kind of what is it that a regulator is willing to tolerate and not. So these documents shouldn't be either sort of secretive or just sitting there on a website for everyone to look at best, but basically the argument would be there needs to be a sort of a regulatory conversation about sort of the underpinnings of the approach and the risks willing to be engaged in and so on. So as I sort of said, the risk appetite is sort of this fight versus flight idea about, what are we willing to accept because we basically would like to achieve. So, do we want to have a rich education, which however might mean that kind of some people might feel uncomfortable at various points about sort of this type of literature one gets exposed to and so on, for example, right? Or do we want to tolerate strain because we want to have a rich debate in the classroom, or do we just basically want to have peace and happiness and harmony in the classroom but don't want to challenge each other? That would be basically sort of the kind of question. But of course, there's clearly some areas where we say, well, we don't want to have any kind of, we don't tolerate any form of risk. So, kind of nobody should come to harm. So here, in educational settings, a safeguarding issue would be sort of as a kind of important, but, kind of to what extent you might say, do we want to say, well, in some areas we allow for far more, we are far more tolerant and accepting of things, kind of than in other areas. And is that something which people in an organization would tolerate. And that is the kind of the fundamental question here about sort of to what extent can there be a coherent view of a risk appetite. And here what sort of in my world of research and so on has been quite central, and that I guess we pick up with this 45-45 splits or 40-50 splits and so on in the poll, is basically the tension between a claimed and actual risk appetite in an organization's kind of concern. So which might have good reasons, or might be sort of the sources of which might be quite unique to each organization. But what one can diagnose is that the leadership might have very often is willing to, let's say, to fight more rather than take flight from certain risks than people at the front line might actually do. Because I mean, to some extent, this might relate to the resources, having sort of to deal with adversarial kind of regulated entities is highly resource intensive, and therefore one doesn't want to take the strain. Therefore, one rather kind of manages in order not to take risks. One possibly might be arguing, there might be, especially beyond the comforts of the boardroom, a concern about the legal implications of certain kind of documents or kind of procedural kind of comments. So there's sort of very strong concern about legal risks, which basically might be seen differently by different individuals in an organization, even by the lawyers themselves. And what one often finds, when one sort of talks about risk appetite, is as a fear of the court. And then the big question is, what is it about the kind of the fear of the court? And for some, this is already, appearing in court, because that is basically seen as something not right, all resource intensive, possibly the second more than the first. But you might argue with a risk appetite setting is being in court is not a bad thing, and one might even lose a few as long as one loses them properly rather than losing them on stupid procedural mistakes, if one wants to call it like that. So in that sense, the key issue here is, for example, about what are the defeats an organization is willing to take in order to establish its claim and so on. And I guess what I suspect exists, and I would love to hear from the participants here too, is informally every organization knows which court defeats it's willing to accept, and which are those which are highly embarrassing. But these can be, highly traumatic, you might sort of say, to an organization. And when one asks about certain court cases in organizations, one finds that basically court cases are being mentioned about this must never happen again, although what exactly it was about the court case is long forgotten in that sense. So these are sort of the kind of issues, I think, where leadership has to communicate quite carefully about these kind of issues. So here, what the usual sort of advocacy is something called healthy skepticism, which the accountants of you would recognize as sort of fundamental principle of audit. So skepticism is basically to be, is to be questioning about whether the stated or formalized kind of documents, both risk-based as well as risk appetite related, are reflecting, you might call, organizational understandings, what is done about it. So not just be happy with formalized documents, but thinking about what is the life behind the documents. But it is healthy in the sense of saying this is all not just rubbish, but rather to what extent can we sort of make it, something which is viable and active in an organization. And that sort of relates also sort of to the question of the capacity point, where we had a sort of 55%, 45% split here. And I think here's sort of three kind of central kind of concerns here. One is, and that I think goes straight to the top risks kind of identified in the first poll, is basic to what extent, kind of is this reputation for competency kind of possible, and kind of to what extent are there sufficient resources available to maintain the reputation for competency. So if basically every single time one goes to court, the court basically says you've done sloppy work because you can't even write a consultation paper, that is you might argue is a risk that organizations are unlikely willing to take. The second is sort of the technical or operational infrastructure. To what extent are there sufficient resources to basically engage with the kind of risk that one is willing to take, or basically does one have to shut up shop because basically the relationship is so adversarial that endless court proceedings are so deteriorating to any other activity one would like to pursue that therefore it is impossible to engage in, you might say, the kind of activities one would like to do. And then certainly, and that relates to the other kind of a point I already raised, is knowledge diffusion of basically the type of risks that the organization is willing to take. So where one has an appetite for tolerating a certain risk rather than sort of seeking to mitigate at all cost. And that sort of goes to the point I already made about sort of organizational views about things that must never happen again, and to what extent is there a shared understanding about these things, or is this myth completely decoupled from the actual case that occurred, and how does that shape behavior in this kind of particular element? So these are sort of the three, I would say, sort of central kind of point about risk appetite and sort of capacity of organizations to manage these kind of activities. So in conclusion, and then we have a few minutes to, for question and answer, and I see there's quite a lot of activity in the Q&A, which so is basically to say sort of what is really what sort of I try to sort of say when one talks about risk appetite and the risks of risk-based regulation, is the kind of concern that regulatory regimes, especially in settings where regulated entities, are highly reactive to sort of the signals, a regulatory regime or an inspectorate or a regulator sends, there's very likely what people in the literature likes to call it, that any kind of regulatory statement leads to, becomes an engine of anxiety. So this is sort of taken from economics in particular, sort of how this work on business ratings by the US, weekly newsletters and so on, which basically fundamentally shapes organizations. So being afraid to go down the ranking basically shapes everything in terms of academic faculty selection, publication, type of teaching, and so on. Is all driven by, the headline figures on that league table. And to some extent, you might say the fear is, to what extent does risk-based regulation become in itself an engine of anxiety for the regulated entities, which then I think is likely to lead to, strengthens a kind of concern about the systemic as well as possibly more important, the catastrophic risks that might be incurred and so on, which then also raises the question about data availability and so on. So to some extent, the key question is not to say we shouldn't be doing this or it's inevitable, but the kind of the concern has to be to what extent are the frameworks we're establishing in our entity, which might be perfectly functional and reasonable from the viewpoint of our committee room, even if it's a virtual one, but to what extent, how are the signals accepted, detected, or received in the regulated sector. And I think that's sort of the critical kind of concern. The second kind of concern, going back, is basically this argument about sort of emerging risk. To what extent, is there sufficient openness in an organization to not just say, here's our risk-based approach, these are the risks we are concerned about, and we are not focusing so much on things that are below the radar. So to what extent does one have the challenge function to open up an organization to emerging risks, which I think is sort of one of the fundamental questions in risk-based regulation. And then, so, even if these emerging risks might not necessarily be within scope of one's own, you might say, authority in that sense, right? So attendance might have something to do with, collapsing public services and nothing to do with, my organization or the attractiveness of my teaching, and I might not be able to do something about it, but I think it should still be, on the risk radar in that sense of an organization. And then sort of thirdly, there's this kind of question about risk appetite, and to what extent, how to bring meaning to risk appetite is not just sort of making sure that this activity is not just sort of one moment where a board spends 15 minutes once a year on an activity, but also how does it communicate these kind of upwards and downwards, these kind of statements to the front line, if one wants to speak it like that. And with that, I have concluded. So I'm now, we can do a few question and answers and so on. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Martin. That was great. We've got a rather large number of questions here, so I'm going to suggest that at the end of this event, I send these to you by email, and we see if we can get you to respond to some of them, and we will put the responses up on the ANZOG website. So the first question, I think, is fantastic. It's a very good question here. The political context of regulation is something that isn't spoken about nearly enough. Can you comment on what impact this has on our ability to manage risk?
Well, I think it goes fundamentally to this question of reputation in that sense. So if and I think basically the key concern is, and I think it's basically drives, one might say, into a, you might say, risk averse, you might say risk appetite. So if the concern is that whatever one does, well, it comes three ways, right? So I think first, the political environment, at least in the UK, I would say, has changed to an extent that regulators, inspectors are often seen as a problem, not as a solution, as part of the wider problem in a sector. So one has to accept that. The second is, to what extent can one maintain, you might say, the reputation for being independent, autonomous from direct ministerial interests. So, how can one decouple oneself from, you might say, a wider governmental agenda that one doesn't necessarily want to be part of, not necessarily by being disloyal to the government line, but by one doesn't, one's own activity should not be informing, you might say, the government line directly in that sense. So how can one decouple? And I think that is sort of a fundamental kind of question. And it does raise a challenge, I think, for the leadership of regulators, whatever their kind of scope is. I think there needs to be a lot of fancy footwork between, you might say, the political directorate and the regulatory entity about basically what are sort of the key challenges here, what are the risks a minister is likely willing to take, you might say, with regulatory kind of places. But I think unfortunately, and I think that's, I don't mean that in any partisan case, I think if the media headlines are bad, which basically goes to the catastrophic risks in particular, I think it will have fundamental implications on the regulator. And I think whatever the independence on the statute is, I think this is sort of the person overboard situation, unfortunately.
Yeah. So there's quite a number of questions up at the top, but I think they're probably too meaty to respond to in the time we have left. So I'm going to try and just sneak down the leaderboard slightly. But again, I will ask you to respond to some of these on by email afterwards. So Martin, what aspects of risk appetite do you think that regulators struggle with most?
I think it is, well, I think within regulators, I think it's basically the communication part. That basically the board, kind of however it is not necessarily connected to the front line. The front line might actually not trust the board to know anything, or it might really wonder about what are these people, on the board saying. They have no connection to this. And I think that is, so on one part, I think that is sort of the fundamental challenge, this communication part. And then related to that, I think is, if it leads then to a disconnect to, I think, the regulated sector, if basically the documents sort of say, we're willing to take all of these things, but then in the day-to-day practice, one ends up with highly risk-averse kind of statement. And I think sort of so if, for example, all consultation documents turn out into some legalese in order to avoid all forms of risk in that sense, one might say one undermines the effectiveness of any form of consultation, which might include, you might say, a bit broader type of communication to attract things. So I think there's sort of a problem here about if one wants to minimize legal risks, you might say, one incurs other type of risks, namely one doesn't get any decent input in that sense.
Yeah. So Martin, there's a bit of discussion here looking for some clarification. So they're saying, are you using inspection as a shorthand for diversity of regulatory activities and tools, or is it more of a narrow lens? Some of our participants have also responded to this, saying that They're concerned that the term inspection is quite a narrow view of regulatory tools. And then another participant has said that they actually think that you're referring to assessment of risk. So just a little bit of clarification on the inspection and whether that's shorthand for a wider range of regulatory activities and tools.
I think so. So I think sort of where sort of my sort of okay. So apology, I should have made that clearer. So in my view, sort of regulatory activities can be broadly separated between what you may want to call sort of standard settings. So what are the things we want to achieve? The ideas about how do I find out? So the information gathering part, to which I would sort of take the inspection part, and you might say there's a data collection and so on part, and then you've got sort of the what you may want to call the sanctioning part. So what are the consequences of discrepancies I might diagnose between what I see and kind of how do I want to sort of bring that entity back into sort of the orbit of acceptability, you might want to say, or give them brownie points for being so brilliant and all that sort of thing. And I think sort of inspection for me, and as well as sort of the pre-inspection and inspection activity for me broadly fits into the world of detection, you might say. So information gathering kind of activities, to what extent do we find out? And then, of course, you might argue the next part of, which I didn't really talk about, is to what extent is there then willingness to do something about it, right? I think that is sort of central here. But not every regulator is able to basically do something about what it basically collects, although it has to be risk-based in doing so. That's why I sort of didn't talk about these kind of components. So this is basically where I wanted sort of to highlight my point. And of course, their issues of risk assessment are fundamental to questions of risk-based regulation. But sort of the question here then is, for the assessment of risk, we need to have certain criteria, which is the KI kind of components and so on. And it is basically the methodologies we use to basically kind of see how it actualizes this. On the question of systemic versus catastrophic risk, that was the other question, right? I've jotted down. So here basically the catastrophic risk is basically, as a systemic risk is basically to what extent does the existence of a regulatory activity, whatever it might be, whether it's risk-based or whatever it might be, to what extent does that generate unintendedly, possibly, these engines of anxiety I mentioned, in the final slide, and therefore basically threatens, you might say, the survival of the system, or kind of puts so much strain on the system that it delegitimizes itself. So you might call it the regulatory burden puts such a strain on the system that it's likely to go down, something disastrous happen, and therefore it delegitimizes itself per se. Although ultimately the activity might still be ongoing, but it is no longer legitimate because it's seen as just a burden. As a systemic is more basically to what extent does it mitigate, contribute or not to the overall survival of the system. So systemic risk is things like, in the wider literature, sort of seen as questions of climate change and so on. So to what extent does it take away, you might say, does it diagnose the fundamental viability of a system, or some people have sort of argued, does it engage in rituals of verification without really diagnosing what is going on, and therefore it misses the next iceberg to move to the Titanic example.
So I think you've probably succeeded in turning me into an engine of anxiety in relation to.
And I hope this was not about the quality of my presentation. So
look, I think that's us very close to time. So I'd like to thank you, Professor Lodge, for getting up extra early to join us today. I'd also like to offer my thanks to our online audience who've been fantastic. There's an awful lot of questions sitting there, and we will make sure to send those through to Martin at the end. You've been really great in helping, giving insights into how you conceptualize and understand risk appetite within your own regulatory organizations. So you will now receive a short evaluation survey, and I ask that you please complete this. This lets us know how you've enjoyed the session today and provide any other feedback to us and suggestions for future events. So our next webinar will be on Monday, the 29th of July, where we will be joined by Martin Stewart Weeks and Angela Clark to discuss regulating in a digital world, a focus on skills and capabilities for regulators. So one final point here, as many of you will already know, we are currently speaking with regulators across the country about our wonderful professional regulator programme. We're seeking your input to determine which level of this programme we should build next. We are conducting surveys, interviews and focus groups. I've popped the link to the survey in the chat box and would really love to hear from you about this programme. So 98% of programme participants have evaluated this as meeting or exceeding their needs. We are incredibly proud of this work and look forward to rolling out the next stage of this with your help and guidance. So wishing you all the very best, and we look forward to welcoming you to another NR COP event in the near future. All the best. Thank you, and thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you.